So let us begin with today's perspective. So first topic is about Northeast matters. See, as we know that there is a sense of alienation among the Northeast segment, and there is also widespread racism. So in that context, discrimination against Northeast people can be applied in the attitude topic of ethics, paper 4. So, observing here a few weeks back, there was a hashtag Northeast Matters which was trending on Twitter to highlight the needs for authorities to concern to educate people and spread awareness about Northeast. There was also a demand to include a chapter on Northeast India in NCRT. So as you know, there is a racial discrimination against Northeast people. So because of the peculiar physical features of Northeast people, they've attracted series of unsolicited remarks, unwarranted racial slurs against them. So racial discrimination against Northeast people can be broadly classified as some are being done intentionally and some are done unintentionally also. Because of the stereotypes, some become unintentional also. So we must break those stereotypes. People from the region are treated as foreigners in their own country. So this is irony that people from that region are treated as foreigners in their own country. There are many other instances when people from the region are called like foreigners, Chinese, Momo. Recently the corona stigma also was attached to the Northeast. There are certain misconceptions about the Northeastern population. For example, the post-pandemic, people from the region are mistaken to be carriers of novel coronavirus because of their physical affinities to the Chinese, and Hindus are minorities in the Northeast against the mainstream thing, and Northeast and are often subjugated. People from the North region have similar food habits. People from this region have similar food habits and language with China that render them as Chinese sympathizers. Snakes and bats are common delicacies of the region. Are a few of the many myths about Northeastern people. No, the Northeast, as you know, is further alienated region. There is also issue of militancy. There is alienation. There is militancy because of ethnicity and clashes involved. And yesterday we discussed about Niti Aayog's report, SDG report in the Northeast. And then it hampers the development activities because of the instability and compounding the problems of the geography because of the topographical terrains, majority of being hills and only little being plains, which is largely in Assam. So there's tough physical terrains in the region. The people are rendered unconnected physically and electronically, enduring the lack of utter absence of communication systems like the internet and mobile networks. So in the 21st century and after 75 years of independence, militancy should not exist as an excuse for underdevelopment, especially in the Northeast. So idea of one nation should be viewed as one resembling a beautiful rainbow with different colors. So as we are, India is known for unity and diversity. So our idea of one nation should resemble a beautiful rainbow with different colors. So the idea of India was as envisioned by founding fathers is not about similarity, it's not about uniformity, but celebrating the beauty of our diverseness. So, in line with that beautiful ethos, which is respecting diversity, accepting diversity, it is time we realize that Northeast people, however different they may appear to us, are no fewer Indians, and their concerns are no less important. So, this is about Northeastern population largely can be used from the societal perspective also, and also from a larger ethics and attitude perspective. So moving on, next is about the declining of pollinators here. uh, as we know that the name mentions buzz fades. So natural pollinators like bees, they increase the crop productivity. So why how they increase crop productivity is because they're essential for reproduction of almost three-fourths of the food crops and flowering plants by facilitating fertilization. So since they facilitate fertilization process, so they help in improving the crop productivity, and they are essential for reproduction of three-fourths of food crops and flowering plants. So temporary solutions can lead to permanent problems, especially what we are being doing in agriculture. So we can underline the statement that temporary solutions can lead to permanent problems. So according to the FAO, the number of hungry people have increased consistently over the last 6 years. So hunger has been increasing. Unfortunately, efforts to mitigate food shortage and rising global food prices are projected to increase by about 25% in 2021 compared to last year. So most have focused on stopgap measures, such as, we have to increase the pesticides, we have to increase the fertilizers to maximize yield. So this chemical application of chemicals or industrial nature of agriculture, which is very chemical intensive, these are harmful to the ecology. Pesticides and fertilizers to maximize yield, this is harmful to the ecology, such as soil, microorganisms, and one aspect of that is the bees or the pollinators. They are negatively affected by use of such chemicals. A recent study has identified these very practices to be the primary reasons behind the decline of population of natural pollinators, like maybe bees, butterflies, wasps, and bats, which is adversely affecting the volume of food produced. See, if these pollinators fade, they would stop facilitating the fertilization, which would ultimately decline the crop productivity, so affecting the volume of food produced and thus contributing to global hunger. Their role is particularly significant in countries like India, where farmers cannot afford large-scale artificial methods of pollination. So even today in various parts of the country, fertilization is being done naturally, and natural pollinators are the bees. So therefore, a decrease in their population would naturally lead to a fall in the quality and quantity of crops. So it's a direct linkage. According to a 2016 report, there has been a 300% increase in the pollinator dependent food production over the past half century. So despite there being an increase, but while other causes of food shortage, such as maybe climate change is one cause of food shortage, because of extremes, droughts and floods, leading to crop damages every year, overpopulation, and then social inequality prevailing in the society. Apart from this, the impact of shrinking population of pollinators. So this has largely been ignored. The impact of shrinking population of pollinators on the global food security. So this dimension has not been focused upon in our global food security discourse. So the need of the hour is to understand the importance of pollinator species and formulate a concrete plan to conserve their numbers. So for this, we have to move towards eco-centric agricultural practice, the use of eco-friendly pesticides and fertilizers. This must be encouraged so that they don't negatively harm the pollinators population. The larger change is to harmonize the needs of ecological sustainability with agriculture production and its practices. So we must harmonize the ecologically sustainable angle with our agricultural practices. So an important article on the role of pollinators can be applied in debate appears on food security, etc. So moving forward, this was a small article with respect to democracy and truth. As you have seen, democracy and truth are, one of the essay themes also. So here, Justice Chandrachud, he framed search of truth as an aspiration in a democratic society. So searching for truth itself is one of the aspirations of a democratic society. In a way, we can give this as a definition of democracy. That in the democratic society, there is a constant quest for the search of truth. So, essence of democracy is in the participation of decisions in a public by citizens, in the public policy by decisions. As we know, public consultation in policy formulation, etc. The speech dwells on the relationship between truth and democracy. So, as we know that UPSC has asked questions on truth, such as wisdom finds truth and all such things. Health of any democracy rests on the foundation of government being truthful about the current state of affairs. So, the government who is ruling us has to be truthful to the governed. Relationship between truth and democracy is both a sword and a shield. So, it has both the angles. So, in effect, a democracy depends on how effectively citizens can exercise their rights to ensure that there is a systemic effort to place the truth in front of them. So, truth should come out in front of them, and citizens need to do their bit also to ensure that the media is free, so that media can do reporting in free and fair manner, highlighting the truth. So, education is key to strengthen the not always the democracy. This is always known that education is fundamental. Children are allowed to develop a temperament. If in education children are allowed the temperament that allows them to pose questions to power. So this should be the way in which children's temperament should be developed from the childhood, that they have to pose questions to those in power. So this is in a way also helps in increasing transparency and accountability in governance. Truth is inextricably intertwined with India's national motto and emblem. As we know, Satyameva Jayate is our motto and emblem. So, in a way, truth is connected there also. The commitment to search for truth is key aspiration for our society. So, democracy produces the best results when it creates the platform for multiple opinions. So, democracy is all about diversity. The more effective decisions come out concerning multiple points of view. When we know multiple points of view, multiple dimensions, then the best possible decision can come out, considering all the pros and cons. So this is about truth and democracy, role of media, citizens, education, and aspect of diversity in the democracy. So moving forward, as we know that there's an Afghan takeover, and we have already discussed the impact on India. So one more article in the line is Afghan takeover and impact of India. The borders, as we know, with Pakistan would require more security investments, as we know that this is a national security issue. So the borders with Pakistan in JNK would require more security investments. Indian diplomacy played a critical role of emotional security, cultural ties, and whatever level of trade which was possible, and in rebuilding mechanisms it could provide in the last 20 years. So thousands of Afghans are in India, as we know, for work, either training or reskilling, education, medical treatment. So over 2,200 students of Afghan origin are studying in India on scholarship. They stare at a very uncertain future. The Indian Council of Cultural Relations would continue to extend the help. So an immediate concern is whether its borders with Pakistan in JNK would require more investment. So this securing the borders would require more investment. Maybe this would call for increased defense expenditure from Indian perspective. Advance this would also impact the impact Afghan takeover would also impact India's bilateral trade with Afghanistan. So this is the economic perspective. First, for the security perspective, from the economic perspective, as we know, the trade between two nations it amounts to roughly 1.4 billion in 2021 and 1.5, hovering around 1.5. So Afghan traders have been hit. Afghanistan, sells dry fruits to India like dried raisin, walnuts, fig, pine nut, almond, dried apricot, pistas, and some herbal medicines. So these are the things which Afghan largely dry fruits. Exports from India stood at 826 million, whereas imports amounted to around 510 million. So we exported more to Afghanistan. India had an ambitious plan with the initiative of INSTC, International North-South Transport Corridor, spans Iran, Central Asia, and Eurasia. So that is also affected. It is also supposed to be linked to the Chabar, which we discussed of being, potential being a dead investment, and the dedicated freight corridor having a special economic zone on its land built by India. So these are broadly the impact from security perspective, strategic perspective, connectivity issues, and the economic angles and as possible impact on India. So moving forward, as we know that because of this, the geopolitics of the region has changed. So Asia and its new arc of instability, what the authors defined it. So anti-Americanism brings China, Pakistan, Iran, and Taliban together. So as we discussed yesterday, this is a new axis which is getting developed. But given one other's self-serving politics, so the developments such as Iran-Russia missile sales agreement, Pakistan-Iran pipeline, Russia's military cooperation agreement with Pakistan, they have set for a new convergence of interest, which is largely against their main adversary, which is America. So anti-Americanism is the common ground for them. The strategic access between China and Pakistan, Taliban, and Iran might ensure that the import routes to Central Asia and Eastern Europe, which India aimed for bypassing Pakistan, may now be no longer available. So, as we discussed, the important sea route, they might not be able to access this trade route. Today, Saudi Arabia has strengthened its defense relations with India. It was no longer like earlier. We also have improved defense relations with Saudi Arabia, and is largely unwilling to support Islamabad's case in Kashmir. So, this is one positive news for us. And coming to the recent Israel and Arab world's relations getting normalized in the form of UAE-Israel deal. Once the Western evacuation is complete, the West will have no strategic inclination to continue its favorable policies of for Pakistan. So this would, in a way, mean that Pakistan, uh, the international community can put more pressure on Pakistan. So thus, the FATF blacklisting and the termination of its GSP plus status can be expected in the near future. So this is a positive sign for India. Islamabad faces serious uprisings in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the northwestern frontier province, and Balochistan. So Afghanistan may now be a sanctuary for anti-Pakistan forces too. On the one hand, the increasing grip of its good Taliban, that is Haqqani Network, Quetta, Shura Taliban. So these are good Taliban from Pakistan perspective, but they are bad Taliban for us. May choke the domestic society and perhaps may even endanger the democratic regime of Imran Khan. So China will try to benefit this from a geostrategic angle, which we discussed yesterday in terms of its BRI connectivity projects, access to minerals, etc. So moving forward, this article is important from the perspective of using the larger issue of water droughts in the country. So Israel, as we know, is very well advanced in terms of harnessing water. This can almost converted a desert land into a paradise. So watering the droughts with Israel, Institute of Indo-Israel Strategic Partnership in India. So this is an institute which is proposed. It is believed that this proposed institute can be the catalyst in achievement of India's water security objectives. So, what are the possible areas of cooperation if we can see from Israel in terms of water cooperation? Is in the face of water scarcity, the issue of water security has become a focus area. We are already a water stressed country because of pollution, because of climate change, because of population growth and groundwater depletion, and also river water pollution. They're putting pressure on water resources, making water management a big challenge. So we are already polluting. There's also an angle of anthropocentric climate change and then population growth. So groundwater is also depleting because of overexploitation. So country begins requires suitable technological intervention, and here the role of Israel comes in, including the areas of water conservation, such as water recycling, integrated water infrastructure in the field of irrigation, advanced transportation, and networking models for drinking water, advanced water practices, building a sustainable water ecosystem. So here, the role of Israel lies. So there are areas where the prospects of Indo-Israel water cooperation are very high, such as the first one being the restoration of water ecosystem. It can help in restoration of many water ecosystems. Critical one being the Critical Desalination Initiative, CDI, as they call Critical Desalination Initiative. So seawater can be harvested. CDI can enhance the green water inventiveness, thus fulfilling the water deficiencies of India. As we know, we have one of the longest coastlines, 3,700 kilometers of coastline. So hence, we have a larger potential for CDI. Israel has excellent technological solutions and innovation in the field of in this field and has emerged a true world leader in the field of water management and water recycling. So areas that requiring technological interventions, which Israel can provide, include like water efficiency. You know that water use efficient products such as drip irrigation, sprinkler, water assessment, monitoring, measurement, management, waste. Once it is done, then the waste water treatment, wastewater recycling, reusing them, groundwater assessment, groundwater recharge, real time detection, situational awareness, the water flow data accuracy, water flow drip irrigation, and certain other precise agro water solutions. So, these are the broad areas in which technological interventions can be sought from Israel. So, India, having a huge set of diverse topographical settings and water bodies, can provide ample possibilities for incubation. Many such incubation projects can be driven by the proposed institute for model water projects. In the long run, such experiments and models can be the answer to hastily approaching water crisis which the country is foreseeing. Yeah, this was about an interesting article about Indo-Israel water cooperation. Moving forward, this article is about the larger debate about environment versus development. So recently there was a people's movement seems to have taken birth across the tribal districts of Kinnaur against ecologically hazardous hydroelectric projects on the Satluj River. So there have been isolated voices of individuals, activists, and NGOs who have come together to say no means no. This is a slogan they have used: no means no against the proposed 804 megawatt Jangi Topan power project. So their unfair cry for protection of their lands, rivers, and forests from denudation assumes significance in the background of multitude of frequent landslides. As we saw last month, there was a landslide in Himachal Pradesh. Mountain slips are taking place because of technologically active region and heavy coupled with heavy rains and flash floods, melting glaciers. This has compounded the problem for the Himachal Pradesh and larger Himalayan ecosystem. So this development versus environment debate has tended always to tilt towards the development at the cost of environment, and certain moneyed lobbies are vying for multi-crore deals here. So this is about this larger debate of environment versus development going on. Again, an important dimension. So as we know, in the same line, there's a famous hills in Karnataka called Nandi Hills. Recently, a landslide happened in Bangalore's this popular tourist spot. It should be a warning call for the government, which has permitted stone quarrying and crushing activities in the vicinity of hills. Again, the aspect of development versus environment has come to picture. But these hills are famously known for tourism, but problem here is many tourists they have scant regard or respect for the surroundings. So because of the poor awareness and insensitive attitude and behavior, so they litter the entire area, so leaving around 30 tons of trash, mainly plastic and liquor bottles, on its precincts every year. So where there is nothing wrong in promoting sustainable tourism, the government should at the same time maintain the ecological balance and protect the character of the hills as a historical center. So this applies to same any tourist station. Moving forward, as we know that police reforms is a long pending issue, so we need an urgent police reforms in the country. So recently, case was the court had sought the report from a TADA report on why a person from Lucknow, this person from Lucknow who was arrested in a case linked to a serial blast on the Babri Masjid episode, is he still in jail? But irony is that there have been no charges framed on him. So without any charges being framed on him, he's been kept in jail. So this is the issue of how the criminal justice system, jails, and police are working. He has moved the court, contending that the speedy trial is part of right to life and liberty, guaranteed by the constitution, and it could not be denied to a citizen. So this speedy trial is part of fundamental right, also part of right to life, acknowledged by Supreme Court in many judgments. So tens of thousands of people are incarcerated in jails without charges being framed and even without a chance of getting bail. A tribal person, for example, if you see this case of a tribal person from Assam, Machul Lung, so we can just mention that a tribal person from Assam who spent 54 years in jail without facing a trial and was released in 2005 after his case was taken up by the human rights group. So 54 years he has spent in jail without facing any trial. See the irony. The Supreme Court said in Arnab Goswami case that no citizen should be deprived of freedom without due process even for a single day. So that should be the line of thought the Supreme Court has told, but the reality on ground is very different. Several factors cause the delay. Investigations are not undertaken in time because the police forces are understaffed, undertrained, and under-equipped. So this is the core problem with the police forces, because for the delay they're understaffed, police to population ratio is very low, they're also undertrained, they don't have the modern means of investigation, because of which they do shabby investigations, and they're also under equipped. uh, Modern methods are not available, so trials go on for years because of judicial delays also. So no one compensates people for their lost lives when they are acquitted of jail because of the years they spent in jail. For example, we can see 54 years were spent in jail without any charges being framed against him. With 70% of jail inmates being under trials, the massive scale of injustice can only be imagined. So 70% of jail inmates, no, they're being under trials. Massive scale of injustice can only be imagined. A suggestion was made uh, made to the Supreme Court recently that bail pleas of life convicts who have undergone 10 years uh, jail term may be considered sympathetically. So most people who are thus punished are from the bottom rungs of society like tribals, Dalits. So deep and extensive judicial and police reforms are needed to ensure that justice is not denied to people and to make justice more humane. Justice ultimately should be humane. It must be kind and it must be caring. So that is why reforms in police and jail is necessary, prison reforms. So as they function now in justice often do not go together. Justice often do not go together, and Supreme Court must ensure that they get a right. These people, especially, they get a right to speedy and fair trial. So moving forward, this was the Hindu editorial important on discussing the issues of rape and insensitivity, especially the gang rape which happened in Mysore. Women's security must not be predicated on the restrictions of their women's rights and freedoms. So, despite stringent laws in place, especially after the Nirbhaya episode, rape occurs every 16 minutes in India. This is the irony. To make matters worse, there are sexist, misogynist, survivor blaming remarks, often from the leaders. So, the sexist, misogynist, and survivor blaming remarks and inept measures inevitably follow uh, any heinous rape crime. Almost its narrative is such the victim is blamed always. So the survivor blaming remarks continue. So girls are pulled up for wearing whatever clothes they wear and for staying out late and what she was doing there, etc. Often argue the often argue the survivor would have evaded the assailants by adhering to conservative norms. So if they had been conservative, then she would have evaded. This is a kind of narrative which is built wearing such as these conservative norms are like wearing traditional attire, like skipping late night parties, returning home by sunset. So these are the conservative norms which the society tries to impose on women. The parents are blamed also for not bringing up their girl with Indian children with Indian values. So if you see Supreme Court in the recent case of Aparna Bhatt versus state of Madhya Pradesh, Supreme Court admitted to the entrenched paternalistic and misogynistic attitudes, so that are regrettably reflected in times in even in judicial orders also. The Supreme Court also has acknowledged. So recent rulings in Chhattisgarh High Court and Kerala High Court reiterating that any sexual act by a man against his wife, even if involved force, is not rape. So this we know that marital rape is not a criminal offense in India. It continues. So even if it is involved force, it's not a rape. So this position is correct by law, but this is served to highlight the lacuna in the penal code, as we discussed about section 375 of IPC. It does not consider marital rape. So Supreme Court had to order police protection to a couple in live-in relationship who were denied relief by Punjab and Haryana High Court. So again, matters going to Supreme Court. Even High Courts are not uh, left behind in such episodes. So women have come a long way fighting for their rights against patriarchal mindset and other social ills. So instead of curbing their freedom, instead of curbing women's freedom that you don't go out, maintain such and such attire and such things, instead of curbing their freedom, society and state must ensure protection of women both in public and private places. Why there is lack of protection for women in public and private places? So this must be questioned, and certain loopholes in laws must also be fixed. So it's a very important article from the narrative of violence against women. How it is, the narrative is largely survivor centric. So how the patriarchy is reinforced. This aspect must be looked into, and the insensitivity also. So moving forward, next this is again important article on development and conservation. So there's a fine line which we have to draw between development and conservation. So infrastructure development and eco conservation should go hand in hand, but of course this is easier said than done. So need for infrastructure, there's a need for infrastructure development in the Himalayan region, rubs up against environmental and ecological challenges, especially Himalaya being very ecologically fragile. The rising frequency of intense rains, as we know, a rising frequency of intense rains has been contributing to landslides, avalanches, and the loss of lives and property. All this has a bearing on the hydroelectric projects being situated in the terrain prone to environmental shocks. So this is very important because of the recent flash flood in Chamoli, the Tapovan hydroelectric project was washed away. So after the devastating Kedarnath floods, the Supreme Court ordered a halt to hydroelectric projects in Alaknanda and Bhagirathi river basins, and further future of projects is closely linked to the future of these hydroelectric projects is also linked to the famous National Mission for Clean Ganga program also. So for the health of the river, for the health of Ganges River in terms of maintaining the e-flow norms, no, these dams are an obstacle because the dam impede the flow of the river, and some stretches of the Ganges might dry up. So this is an obstacle. So there have been divisions even within the central ministries. For example, Water Resource Ministry, it manages the NMCG, is opposed to hydropower projects, while the Power Ministry wants it because of power. So this is the conflict or a conflict of interest which exists between various ministries. So avalanche in Chamoli this February that destroyed two power projects and killed at least 200 was only the latest reminder of the fraught risks that committees and their tussles inadequately account for. So, a critical example, direct thing, which links to the conflict between hydroelectric projects and uh, the local conditions. So, moving forward, as we know, because of there is a EV push in the country, so there is EV race among the states, electric vehicle race among the states. So, Odisha on Friday announced its EV policy. It became the 10th state to do so. So this policy is in line, the policy guidelines to make transition from conventional fossil fuel based mobility to electric mode. So we're moving towards uh, moving away from the fossil fuel based mobility to electric mobility. So EV policy includes the subsidies, interest subventions, incentives for manufacturers, and battery production, among others. As we know, batteries almost account for more than half of the total cost of EV vehicles. So, race among the states is a good sign as India fervently seeks to cut down on its fuel consumption. So, transition towards EV also has a positive multiplier effect in terms of pollution, in terms of reducing the import bill, foreign exchange reserves, and all the climate change impact also. So 80% of its oil imports currently, whatever we do, it is going to the transport sector needs. It is also mandated to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 35% of 2005 levels in another 9 years, that is 2030, as per the to meet the global climate targets. So close to 80% of vehicles in India are currently two-wheelers. So two-wheeler will drive the demand of EVs in the coming future. The center has extended the FAME scheme now till 2024 in this regard. So FAME scheme also becomes important. The government's support to manufacturing, R&D, and subsidy, and scrapping. Recently, vehicle scrapping policy was also announced. To this vehicle scrapping has been found to increase demand wherever it has been introduced across the globe. It must show intent by investing robustly in battery manufacturing, as we discussed. Half of the production cost is from the where cost of the vehicle is in battery, and charging infrastructure is needed so that um, there is larger acceptability. Currently, if you see, there's negligible charging infrastructure everywhere, and one way to drive this is EVs adopt EVs in the public transport system. So adopting it in public transport will create a larger ecosystem and will have spillover effect. Central and state governments must lead by inducting EVs for office use. So EVs for office use is the right way forward. So moving forward, so this article was about TB, tuberculosis. As we know, India has the highest global TB burden. There has been a setback against TB because of the stoppage of funding by global health agencies and a web of bureaucratic procedure. The operation of JEET. JEET is Joint Effort for Elimination of TB, project funded by various international non-profit agencies and implemented by Central Tuberculosis Division of Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So India has the highest burden, around 27% cases in the world. So TB is no longer a disease of the poor. As you know that earlier TB was to consider a disease of the poor, but now it's no longer a disease of the poor, like undernutrition, indoor air pollution, smoking habits, alcohol addiction are all barriers that stall TB elimination in the country across the socio-economic groups. So Project GEAT was launched in 2018 by three global health agencies: Clinton Health Access Initiative, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, and US-based non-profit Path. So under the project, private patients will receive free, quality-assured diagnostic and treatment services. So now this has been stopped in a way. So that's why tax is a setback to our fight against TB. So after 3 years of funding and overseeing the project, the international agencies began the process of transitioning out on the funding front, largely due to problems arising of red tapeism. So, the ambitious goal of elimination of TB by 2025 cannot yield desired results unless the private sector is roped in, given the bureaucratic limitations. Private health sector India serves as the first point of contact for over 60% of TB cases. That's why the role of private becomes important. Prolonged lockdowns and the COVID has focused prolonged lockdowns and restrictions on many hospitals for only COVID services. So many hospitals have been turned only to COVID services. Coupled with the stigma among patients, they pose challenges for the TB program. Lockdowns, restrictions on all kinds of movements, and only prioritizing COVID over other major diseases, and the social stigma. So diversion of staff also, primarily to lab technicians, led to significant fall in TB detection. So this is about the setback against TB. So moving forward, this article is important considering as we discussed, the fact of national monetization pipeline. Just one liner that this topic directly hits the public-private partnership model. So if the PPP mod works well, then only the NMP might succeed, because PPP mode of investment is being tried on a larger scale now across sector. Earlier, it was restricted to maybe roads or airports, but now almost 20 asset categories have been identified. So PPP mode of investment is being tried on a larger scale for NMP. And then coming to the geopolitics, as we saw, we can remember this golden line that geopolitics is driven more by national interest than by values. So national interest is first in the priority of international relations for any country. So geopolitics is driven by national interest first, and then values, and power is a language. So power is a language which is in which it is communicated. So geopolitics is conveyed through power. It is the newly gained power of Taliban that speaks it all. So this was about today's perspective.